Hypothermia does not begin with screaming. It begins with surrender. The body gets quiet. The mind gets soft. And if nobody pulls you back, you start agreeing to die. 5 days after her husband was buried, Mara Ellison was handed a legal folder on her own porch, pushed off her mountain in a whiteout, and left with one dying pickup, 3 horse blankets, and a Pulaski. By June, she would walk back up that same road in a charcoal suit and own the debt on every property the man had. In the last week of November, the ground in the Cabinet Mountains had already gone iron hard under the first deep cold. Mara buried her husband Ben beneath a stand of tamarack behind the cedar and stone cabin they had rebuilt together over 11 years. Ben had been a stonemason and restoration contractor, the kind of man who could look at a collapsed wall and tell you, almost by feel, which rocks still wanted to stand. He died when a retaining wall failed on a county job and crushed him before the crew could pull him free. At 41, Mara went from married to hollow in a single afternoon. The cabin should have been the one place grief could happen in private. Instead, it became the stage for an execution. 5 days after the funeral, a black diesel truck came grinding up the driveway just after dawn. Nolan Ellison stepped out first, Ben's older brother. Perfect wool coat, expensive gloves, the expression of a man who had already decided compassion was inefficient. He did not arrive alone. County Deputy Wes Cross climbed out after him, hat low, eyes down. Nolan carried a manila folder. "I'll keep this clean," he said, like he was doing her a favor. Ben collateralized the property against equipment debt 18 months ago. He defaulted. I acquired the note through my holding company. The transfer is complete. The court signed possession yesterday. Mara stared at him. No. Read the packet. We built this place with our hands. And Ben borrowed against it with his signature. Deputy Cross still would not look at her. That was what made it feel official, not the paperwork. The shame. Mara asked for a week, then 3 days, then 1 night. Nolan refused every time. A Seattle buyer was supposed to inspect the property the next morning for a luxury winter lodge project, and he wanted the cabin empty before the snow got worse. When the wind started driving ice pellets sideways across the porch, Mara understood the truth. Nolan was not removing her from a house. He was moving her into the weather. She packed what mattered in under an hour. Ben's Pulaski, a canvas tarp, 3 horse blankets from the tack shed, a Dutch oven, matches in a sealed tin, half a sack of red lentils, rolled oats, flour, salt, coffee, a jar of rendered tallow, 2 canteens, a skinning knife, a coil of wire, a lantern with barely half a tank of kerosene. When your life is stripped to weight, warmth becomes the only honest currency. Mara threw everything into Ben's old Chevy K1500 and drove downhill through the first hard bands of snow, crying so hard the road kept doubling in front of her. She only made it 6 miles. The truck had been eating coolant for weeks. On the steepest part of the logging road, the engine temperature spiked. The hood coughed steam, and the motor locked so violently the whole truck shuddered sideways into a drift. She tried the key once. A click. Twice. Nothing. Outside, the storm deepened with terrifying speed. The kind of mountain snow that erases edges first, then distance, then hope. The nearest highway was still miles away, the nearest lit window even farther. If she started walking blind into that whiteout with 40 pounds of gear and fading light, the mountain would take her before midnight. So she forced herself to think. 2 summers earlier, Ben had shown her something half as a joke and half as a backup plan. Off an old game trail above the drainage, hidden behind a shelf of broken limestone and lodgepole roots, there was a forgotten prospect opening from an 1880s silver claim. Not a true mine, more like a deep cut in the mountain with one dry interior chamber, and an old ventilation fissure somewhere above. If the world ever gets stupid, Ben had told her, tapping the rock with his knuckles, this place will outlast all of us. It was less than 2 miles away. Mara wrapped one horse blanket over her shoulders, lashed the supplies with the tarp, shouldered the Pulaski, and stepped into the storm. The climb nearly killed her. Snow drove into her eyes so hard it felt granular. The trail vanished every few minutes. Her gloves soaked through. Her fingertips burned, then went numb. Twice she slipped on buried stone and had to drag herself back up with one knee and the Pulaski handle. By the time she found the prospect cut, she was shaking so hard her teeth clicked against each other. The opening was a slash in the rock no wider than a barn door. Black inside, dry, windless. She stumbled in, dropped the gear, and sat on the ground for too long, because lying down felt too good. That was the first real warning. She slapped herself hard, stood up, and got a fire going just inside the entrance, with broken timber and dry needles from under the overhang. For 10 minutes, it felt like rescue. Then the smoke dropped. The chamber was bigger than Ben had made it sound. High ceiling, broad, cold walls. Every scrap of heat lifted, vanished, and died in the rock while the smoke rolled upward, spread flat, then sank back down in a choking gray sheet. Mara spent her first night coughing, half frozen, wrapped in blankets that smelled like wet horse and ash. At dawn, her lips were blue. She understood one thing with absolute clarity. If she tried to heat the whole chamber, she would die. So she stopped thinking about the mountain and started thinking about a box. Before Ben's accident, the two of them had been obsessed with passive heat, masonry stoves, and old survival architecture. Ben liked to say that people froze because they fought winter at the wrong scale. Stone did not fight winter. Stone stored the argument and gave it back slowly. Mara could not warm the chamber, but she might be able to build one tiny space inside it that would hold heat long enough to keep a human being alive. At the rear of the chamber, an ancient wash had left piles of flat shale, rounded river stone, and clay-heavy sediment. Mara found an inset in the wall where the mountain itself could serve as one side of a shelter. For 3 days, while the storm buried the outside world, she worked like someone being hunted. She carried stones 1 armload at a time until her biceps trembled. She hacked blue-gray clay out of a damp seam with the Pulaski blade. She mixed the clay with pine duff, grit, and melted snow until it made a brutal, sticky mortar. She stacked rock into a low sleeping cell just big enough for a body, maybe 6 feet long and barely shoulder wide, with the mountain wall acting as the back. She roofed it with dead saplings cut from near the entrance, layered brush over the poles, stretched the tarp across the top, then packed the whole thing with dirt, shale chips, and snow-crusted debris for insulation. It looked less like a shelter than a grave with engineering. But the real problem was not the walls. It was breath. Any fire inside that little chamber would cook her or suffocate her. Any fire outside it would waste heat into the stone void. She needed the flame close enough to load the walls with warmth, but separate enough to keep smoke out of her lungs. On the 4th day, half delirious and desperate, Mara went deeper into the chamber to mine more clay. When the Pulaski struck metal, the sound rang through the rock like a church bell. She dropped to her knees and dug with both hands. Beneath a slide of old scree and rotted planks was the collapsed remains of a miner's tool alcove. Rusted hinges, a broken shovel head, and, buried beneath all of it, 3 sections of heavy cast-iron stovepipe and the stub of a square firebox collar. Mara actually laughed. It came out cracked and ugly, but it was laughter. The old prospectors had solved her problem a century before she got there. She built a firebox into the outer wall of the sleeping cell and fitted the salvaged pipe to the rear opening. Of the chamber, almost invisible in the soot-dark stone, she had already noticed a thin fissure pulling cold air upward. Now she angled the pipe toward it, sealed the joints as best she could with clay, and prayed the draft would hold. That night, the temperature outside fell below 0. Mara lay inside the stone cell with one hand on the Pulaski and lit a fistful of dry twigs and split scrap in the firebox. The pipe pulled immediately. Smoke slid backward, lifted, and vanished. The walls began to drink heat. At first, nothing changed. Then, everything did. The stone beside her shoulder grew warm. Then the floor under the blankets. Then the low roof above her chest. Not blast furnace hot, not campfire heat. Something stranger. A slow, deep warmth radiating out of mass instead of flame. Mara pulled off her wet outer coat and started crying into the blanket, because for the first time since Nolan handed her the folder, she no longer felt like prey. She had not beaten winter. She had forced it to fight on her terms. That changed the math of everything. She did not need whole trees. She needed bundles of dry branches, roots, splintered timber, and pine cones. One hard burn in the firebox could load the walls for hours. The chamber stayed freezing. The cell stayed survivable. She had built a battery out of stone. By mid-January, the Cabinet Mountains were buried under drifts taller than truck hoods. From the entrance, the world was a white blindness, broken only by black fir trunks and the occasional knife edge of rock. Inside the warmed cell, Mara built a schedule, because losing time felt too much like losing language. Wood, snow, water, fire. Count the lentils, patch the clay, sleep, repeat. The lentils shrank first, then the oats, then the flour. She cut herself down to one thin meal a day and coffee black enough to feel medicinal. Her face sharpened. Her clothes hung loose. Her hips bruised against stone when she slept. The hunger became a second season, one that lived under her ribs. Then she noticed the tracks. At first, they were only loops in the snow near the entrance. Large, deliberate, too round for Wolf, too silent in what they implied. A cougar had found her. The winter had driven deer down slope. Anything still hunting high country was hungry enough to gamble. The smell of smoke, food, and blood from cracked knuckles made the prospect cut a signal fire. After that, Mara never stepped outside unarmed. The tension was worse than the cold. Every snapped twig made her pivot. Every scrape of loose crust above the entrance sounded like paws on rock. The attack came in February, on a colorless afternoon when the whole sky looked made of tin. Mara had gone no more than 30 yards from the opening to cut deadfall from a standing pine killed by beetles. The wind was moving downhill, carrying her scent away and masking anything behind her. She buried the Pulaski in the trunk, twisted, and felt it before she heard it. That prehistoric surge of warning that has nothing to do with thought. She turned. The cougar was already in motion. Big male, gaunt from winter, shoulders rolling under hide, eyes fixed, empty, committed. There was no roar, no bluff, no circling, just a body launched at her throat. Mara yanked the Pulaski free and swung on instinct. The adze end clipped the cat's shoulder and spoiled the angle, but the impact still hit like a dropped boulder. She went backward into the snow, breath gone, left forearm ripped open through coat and wool. The cougar hit the ground, wheeled, and came again. She understood in one bright, horrible flash that she would not win a second swing. So she stopped trying to. Mara jammed the Pulaski handle deep into the packed snow, braced both hands, and angled the steel point upward like a stake. The cougar drove onto it with its own momentum. The scream that followed was half animal, half metal. The handle snapped. Blood sprayed hot across Mara's face. The cat thrashed once, twice, then collapsed, so close she could see the steam leaving its nose. Mara lay there shaking, one arm open and bleeding into the snow, staring at the dead thing that had almost turned her into meat. Then the practical part of her took over. She dragged the carcass to the cold edge of the chamber before dark. She cleaned and bandaged her arm with boiled cloth. The next day, she butchered the cougar with the skinning knife and a sharpened shard of slate. The meat was tough and gamey. The fat was a miracle. Protein put strength back into her legs. Fat put heat back into her thinking. The hide, scraped and cured with ash and salt, became a dense outer cover for the stone bed that trapped warmth better than the blankets ever had. The animal came to eat her. Instead, it bought her another month. By March, cabin fever hit harder than hunger. Storms pinned her inside for days at a time. The little routines that had kept her sane started to fray. So Mara went back to the collapsed alcove where she had found the stovepipe and began digging for no reason except movement. The work uncovered timber braces, then a rotted crate lid, then a sealed recess behind a fall of stone. What she opened was not a tool niche. It was a hidden cache. Inside were 2 iron lockboxes wrapped in oilcloth that fell apart in her hands. In the first, dark bullion ingots, hand-poured and stamped with an extinct regional assay office. In the second, leather bankrolls of Liberty Head half-eagles, silver dollars packed in sawdust, and an old payroll ledger from a private silver outfit that had vanished in the 1890s. Mara sat in the dirt with lamp smoke in her hair, cougar blood still under her fingernails, and stared at the kind of money that changes who gets to say no. Most people would have seen rescue. Mara saw leverage. Nolan had used paper to turn winter into a weapon. Now the mountain had handed her better paper. The thaw came hard in late May. Snow collapsed off the ledges in slabs. Meltwater hammered down the ravine. The first morning Mara stepped out for good, she hardly recognized her own balance. She was lighter by 20 pounds, stronger through the shoulders, scarred across the forearm, and hard in a way grief had not made her before. Grief had hollowed her. Winter had shaped the edges. She packed 10 gold coins, 2 ingots, the payroll ledger, and nothing sentimental. The Chevy still sat where the engine had died, half buried and rust-streaked. She walked past it. 12 miles later, She flagged down a propane delivery driver on the county road and rode into Libby looking like something the mountains had chosen not to finish. At First Mountain Bank, the teller's expression hovered between alarm and pity until Mara placed an 1898 Liberty coin on the marble counter and asked for a metals appraiser. By the end of the week, she had a hotel room, medical stitches, clean clothes, and the first real number attached to the cash. It was enough. Not yacht money, not dynasty money, but enough to weaponize debt. Mara retained Lena Pike, a commercial litigator with the moral warmth of a blade. Pike dug into Nolan's holding company and found exactly what Mara needed. Nolan had seized the cabin, assuming he could flip the acreage to a resort syndicate from Seattle. But the deal died after winter access failed, and a geotechnical survey flagged the slope below the house as unstable for the terraced build they wanted. Nolan had bridged the acquisition with high-interest private notes against his other properties and was bleeding cash every week the land sat unsold. "He isn't rich," Pike told Mara in her office, turning a file toward her. "He's leveraged. That's very different. 2 creditors are already preparing to dump his paper." Mara read the numbers once, then looked up. "Buy it." Pike blinked. "Which part?" "All of it that matters first." Within 10 days, Mara's money moved through a trust. Pike bought controlling positions in Nolan's short-term notes, and the moment the signatures cleared, she called them. Accounts froze. Extensions vanished. Properties tipped. By the first week of June, Nolan was selling machinery, vehicles, and office furniture just to slow the collapse. It did not slow. The final notice was scheduled for a Friday morning. Deputy Cross was there again. So was Nolan. He stood on the porch of Mara's cedar and stone cabin, surrounded by banker boxes and rolled architectural plans, looking less like a developer than a man who had finally met arithmetic. When the black sedan came up the drive behind Pike's vehicle, Nolan turned with irritation already on his face. Then Mara stepped out. Clean hair, charcoal suit, where the cougar had opened her arm. The same mountain under her boots, the same porch, the same wind in the trees. Nolan went white. For a second, he looked genuinely frightened, not because she was alive, because he understood what that meant. "I heard you disappeared," he said. Mara took the folder from Pike and walked to the bottom step. "You meant froze." He glanced at Deputy Cross, then back at her. "How did you even—" "It doesn't matter." When she handed him the packet, his fingers shook before they touched it. He looked at the trust name, then at Pike, then back at Mara. "No." This time, it was his turn to say it. Mara's voice stayed level. "You used a note to take my house. I bought your notes and took your life apart with the same tool." Nolan flipped pages he could not afford not to understand. "The possession order is valid," Pike said. "You have until noon to remove what is listed as personal property. Everything else stays." Mara let that sit for a moment. Then she added the line she had saved all winter. The paperwork is ironclad, Nolan. The deputy closed his eyes for half a second, as if some old debt of shame had finally come due. Nolan wanted a scene, wanted anger he could answer with anger. Mara gave him nothing. No raised voice, no shaking hands, no triumph. That was the final humiliation. He dragged his boxes to the truck himself. When he drove away, Mara stood on the porch and listened until the engine sound dissolved into wind and runoff. Then she touched the doorframe Ben had set by hand. The mountain had taken her husband. It had stripped her to muscle, nerve, and hunger. It had nearly frozen her, bled her, and buried her. But it had also taught her the difference between shelter and ownership. Shelter is where you hide. Ownership is where nobody can move you from again. Mara stepped inside, set the folder on the kitchen table, and looked out through the west window at the dark line of timber climbing toward the prospect cut hidden above the drainage. Nolan had believed winter was a sentence. He was wrong. For Mara Ellison, winter had been training.